Chapter 12 Forward. By May 25th, the enemy had brought up 15 to 16,000 bayonets and 3 to 4,000 sabers against the Russian army. We had received recent information that the Red Command were preparing to launch a serious offensive in a few days' time. Numerically, our army was slightly superior to the enemy's, and their morale was excellent. The troops had been reduced to 4: General Kutupov's 1st Army Corps, General Slokchov's 2nd Army Corps, General Pisarev's Mixed Army Corps, General Abramov's Don Army Corps. We had 25,000 combatants, counting bayonets and sabers. The fleet contributed 1/5 to 1/6 of our total effective force. Only General Morozov's 2nd Cavalry Division of 2,000 swordsmen, which formed part of the 1st Army Corps, and the mixed brigade of Terek and Astrakhan Cossacks had horses. The mixed and the Don Army Corps had only a mounted detachment of 150 to 200 swordsmen. The rest of the cavalry regiments were on foot. My order of May 21st put the following objectives before the troops. General Slokchov's troops had been relieved by General Pisarev's on the Salkovo front. So were to embark at Feodosia, make a coastal attack in the Kirilovka-Goryeloy area, cut off the Salkovo-Melitopol railway, and later cooperate with General Pisarev's troops and operate against the rear of those Red forces massed along the Perekop front. Generals Pisarev and Kutupov were to attack the enemy at dawn on May 25th, beat them, and drive them back towards the Dnieper. General Abramov was to keep the Don Army Corps in reserve at my disposal near Jankoy Station. One section of the fleet had entered the liman of the Dnieper to support our left flank during the operation. The exact moment for the opening of hostilities and the place fixed for the disembarkation had been kept secret. The General Staff had purposely spread the rumor that a disembarkation was to take place near Novorossiysk or Odessa. General Slokchov was not to unseal his orders until he was in mid-sea with his troops. On May 20th, I signed the following appeal to the people. Order of the Regent and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. Sebastopol, number 3226, May 20th, 1920. The Russian army is about to free its native soil from the red yoke. I call upon all the Russian people to help me. I have signed the law concerning the local zemstvos, and I have reconstituted the zemstvos in the occupied territories. The agricultural land belonging to the state or to private owners will be given by the local zemstvos themselves to those who till it. I call every Russian citizen to the defense of his country and to the works of peace, and I promise to pardon all wrongdoers who now return to our side. For the people, the land, and liberty in the framework of the state. For the land, a master chosen by the will of the people. May the blessing of God be upon us. General Wrangel. This appeal was made public on May 25th. The prikaz concerning the land had already gone to press. I arrived at Feodosia on the morning of the 22nd and found General Slokchov's troops embarking. The troops made an excellent show. General Slokchov himself was optimistic and self-confident. I spent only 2 or 3 hours in Feodosia. I visited all the ships which had troops on board and spoke to the officers and soldiers. I then gave my final instructions and went back to Sebastopol. On the evening of May 23rd, my general staff and I left for Jankoy, near the front. A radiogram arrived on the evening of the 24th, announcing that General Slokchov's troops had disembarked successfully near Kirilovka, although the disembarkation had been accomplished under extremely difficult conditions and during a raging tempest. In the dawn of May 25th, the army opened the offensive all along the front. General Pisarev's units attacked the Reds after a short prelude by the artillery, supported by tanks and armored cars, whilst General Slashchov's coastal force was approaching the railway by forced marches. Attacked from the front and threatened in the rear, the Reds fled almost without resisting. We took several hundred prisoners and 2 guns. Simultaneously, General Kutupov's Army Corps attacked the bulk of the Soviet forces on the Perekop front. Tanks and armored cars went ahead of our troops to destroy the barbed wire. The Reds put up a fierce resistance. The Let units were the most obstinate fighters. The Red artillerymen posted their guns between the houses in the villages they were occupying and fired almost point blank on our tanks. Many were wrecked, but nevertheless, the infantry used them to seize all the fortified positions. In this one day, we took 15 big guns and 3 armored cars, not to mention the prisoners and machine guns. Heavy fighting continued on May 26th. General Slokchov's units fought their way to the railway towards evening and took 1,000 prisoners. General Pisarev's mixed corps and General Kudapov's command continued to advance, though the Reds put up a desperate resistance. During these 2 days of fighting, the 1st Army Corps took 3,500 prisoners, 25 guns, and 3 armored cars. Our own losses were very heavy, especially amongst the officers. In one of the regiments of the 1st Army Corps, all the battalion and company commanders had been killed or wounded. On May 28th, General Slokchov took Melitopol Station and succeeded in holding the town in spite of furious attacks from the Reds, who brought up fresh reserves from Alexandrovsk. The Red forces at Perekop, which were retreating on Kakhovka, had also been reinforced. The Red command sent a division of sharpshooters marching along the Don to the Polish front to attack the units which had encountered the 13th Army. The Reds strove to resume the offensive, but we repulsed their every attack. On May 29th and 30th, there was still heavy fighting under Melitopol. The 1st Army Corps and the Mixed Corps held their positions. The transport and part of the Red infantry had been forced to retreat across the Dnieper and blow up the bridges. Between May 25th and the 30th, the 13th Soviet Army had lost 8,000 prisoners, 30 big guns, and 2 armored cars, besides a large number of machine guns and huge stocks of ammunition. On May 30th, I ordered all the troops to complete the overthrow of the enemy by a vigorous pursuit. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I left for Sebastopol. In the last few days, the Red position at the front had changed. Whilst our army had been attacking them, the Bolshevists had been launching an offensive against the Poles. On May 27th, the Red troops took Bielaya-Tsirkov, thus penetrating the Polish front. On May 30th, they occupied Fastov and forced the passage of the Dnieper 60 versts to the north of Kiev, thus cutting off the Kiev-Korostin railway. On May 31st, the Polish troops abandoned Kiev. The Bolshevists made great play with their recent successes against the Poles, but kept as quiet as they could about their defeat in the south. Urgent measures were indispensable if law and order were to be established in the newly occupied territories. Much had already been done. In some places, there was already a certain amount of civil machinery centered in the Army Corps commanders, for the army carried high the flag of law and order. Isolated cases of breaches of the law by the troops were immediately and mercilessly punished. Military judicial commissions and representatives of the people kept a jealous eye on legality at the front, and yet still stronger measures were necessary. One of the most urgent needs was the regularization of the counter-espionage system, especially the supervision sections. On May 28th, an order was promulgated. The unique character of the counter-espionage organs and the grave charges which their actions had, not without reason, provoked in the days of my predecessors, made it absolutely necessary to submit them to strict supervision. We decided to go back to the pre-revolutionary system, which submitted inquiries brought against political criminals by a constable to the control of the attorney. The military attorney general was to cooperate with the chief of the Department of Justice, and regulations defining their powers were drawn up in great detail. My prikaz of July 8th, No. 91, entrusted the task of supervising criminal inquiries and political crimes to members of the military attorney's department at the front and to the civil attorney behind the lines. The above-mentioned magistrates had to supervise all inquiries into political matters, give as much help as they could, watch the legality of all arrests, and be responsible for the criminals under arrest. This was the first time in 3 years of civil war that political actions had been submitted to the control of the attorney. On May 31st, a prikaz was published appointing chiefs of military jurisdiction. One was to be attached to the general staff of each army corps. The work of Bolshevist agents had been much less effective lately. In April, some of the members of the Central Communist Organization at Simferopol had been arrested. At this time, Comrade Nicholas Babakan was their leader. He had come from Soviet Russia. This organization had set its hand to the willful destruction of railway communications. The members did their utmost to damage the tracks and the points, and blew up bridges and armored trains. A large quantity of explosives fell into the hands of the police as a result of the raid on the CCO's premises. This organization was in close touch with the Bolshevist section of the 7th Reserve Battalion garrisoned in Simferopol, the armored car detachment near the Commander-in-Chief's headquarters, and the Greens skulking in the mountains under Captain Orlov's leadership, whom I have already mentioned. At about the same time, a Bolshevist organization at Kerch was successfully rooted out, and a machine gun, some rifles, and a large number of pyroxylin cartridges were confiscated. Since the beginning of the spring, the Bolshevists had been conducting their activities from the woods, merely keeping on rooms in the towns and other settlements to serve as meeting places for the conspirators, an essential thing if they were to keep the communist sections in touch with themselves and with Soviet Russia. The bands of Greens consisted largely of the riffraff of the population, deserters, common law criminals, and Bolshevists who had been transported from Kharkov to the Crimea, but who had escaped from Simferopol prison during the winter. There were not more than a couple of dozen men in these bands altogether, but we knew that the Bolshevists were taking advantage of the fact that no effective watch was being kept on the Crimean shores from the sea, and were preparing to reinforce the Greens with new recruits and to supply them with weapons and money. Motorboats came from Anapa and Novorossiysk carrying men and guns, which they disembarked at some deserted spot at dead of night, leaving them to take the mountain road and join the Greens. The battle against enemy propaganda behind the lines needed an energetic and experienced man as its leader. I decided to entrust it to General Klimovich, ex-director of the police department. At the front, the enemy were retreating in hasty disorder. The 13th Soviet Army had suffered heavy losses during the fighting, which had lasted from May 25th to June 4th. Almost 75% of the effectives of some of their regiments had gone. During the retreat, the enemy units had been thrown into great confusion. They had lost touch with one another and with their general staffs. Enormous quantities of reserve stores had fallen into our hands. The most fertile districts of northern Taurida were freed, and immediately the cost of foodstuffs in the Crimea fell. Our cavalry obtained horses. A large amount of paper money was issued just at a useful moment, and the units paid cash for the horses at current market prices. The commissions of military jurisdiction punished all cases of arbitrary requisitioning without mercy. In the majority of cases, the offender was a Don Cossack, for the Cossacks were unaccustomed to fighting on foot and did their best to obtain horses without troubling very much about the means they employed. In the early days, complaints against the Cossack troops had simply flowed in, but after 2 regimental commanders had been forcibly discharged and the commissions of military jurisdiction had given several very severe verdicts, complaints ceased altogether. In spite of our heavy losses, the troops, stimulated by our victory, were full of enthusiasm. The population had been suspicious of us at first, fearing molestation and pillaging, but they were soon convinced that the Russian army had changed its character and that our units had nothing in common with those of a few months ago, who had been indistinguishable from Bolshevists. Many a time on my journeys, I would stop to chat with the peasants in the villages, and I never heard anything but good of our troops. I went from Chernaya Dolina to Kahovka, where I inspected the cavalry regiments of General Barbovich's division. General Barbovich was an excellent cavalry commander. He understood his work thoroughly and was a very brave and high-spirited man with an exceptionally fine character. He was as hard on other people as on himself and had earned the respect and affection of his subordinates. Every section of the Crimean press was unanimous in its rejoicing. When M. Krivachin arrived, General Chatilov had been appointed chief of my staff. I had foreseen this appointment long ago, but I had put it off until a propitious moment should arise, as I did not want to upset the whole organization of the staff immediately after I took over the command. General Makarov was appointed military representative in Poland. It was urgently necessary that we should coordinate our operations with those being conducted on the Polish front, but the political situation excluded any possibility of a direct understanding with the Polish government and demanded extraordinary tact on our side. We had to cooperate with the Poles in military operations without tying ourselves down to any political agreement. General Makarov was capable of coping with this complicated political and military situation. On June 4th, I went to Melitopol and arrived there at twilight. I went straight from the station to the cathedral, where I heard the Te Deum. After the service, I spoke to the people outside and explained to them that the Russian army was bringing them not vengeance and reprisals, but liberation from the red yoke, peace and quiet and order, and that soon every working man would be able to live in safety and enjoy the fruits of his labors under the protection of the Russian army. I explained briefly the essence of the measures we proposed to take for the organization of the district zemstvos and the redivision of land amongst the peasants. At the same time, I emphasized the fact that the authorities, friendly as they were towards all classes of the population, would not tolerate any breach of the law, and should any occur, would punish them mercilessly. A huge crowd of several thousand listened to me in complete silence. When I finished speaking, the square echoed with loud cheers which burst from thousands of throats.